So both the Democrats' position of popular sovereignty and the Republicans' stand against the expansion of slavery received serious blows during the Buchanan administration. Republicans attacked Buchanan as a weak president under Southern control. One of Buchanan's first challenges as president was deciding whether to accept or reject a pro-slavery state constitution for Kansas, which was submitted by the Southern legislature at Lecompton. It was pretty obvious that the Lecompton Constitution did not have the support of the majority of settlers. But even so, President Buchanan asked Congress to accept the document and then admit Kansas as a slave state. Congress chose not to do so because many Democrats, including Stephen Douglas, joined with the Republicans in rejecting the Lecompton Constitution. So it's in the next year that the pro-slavery document was overwhelmingly defeated by the majority of Kansas settlers, most of whom were anti-slavery Republicans. So Buchanan is being seen as a very weak president in the late 1850s. So outside of Illinois, the Republicans did really well in the congressional elections of 1858, which is a fact that alarmed many Southerners. They worried not only about the anti-slavery plank in the Republicans' program, but also about the Republicans' economic program, which favored the interests of Northern industrialists at the expense of the South. The higher tariffs pledged in the Republican platform could only help Northern business and therefore hurt the Southern dependence on the export of cotton. Southerners feared that therefore a Republican victory in 1860 would spell disaster for their economic interests and also threaten their constitutional right, as affirmed by the Supreme Court, to hold slaves as property. So prior to if we're still in the late 1850s, there's a number of constitutional issues that are going to change the whole debate between slave states and non-slave states. Congressional folly and presidential weakness or ineptitude really contributed to the sectional crisis of the 1950s. But then you pull in the Supreme Court, which really doesn't calm the situation because they infuriated the North with their very controversial pro-slavery decision in Dred Scott versus Sanford. So here's the background. Dred Scott here had been a slave in Missouri, and then he was taken to the Free Territory of Wisconsin and Illinois. So he was kept as a slave in Wisconsin and Illinois. Then he was returned to Missouri, where he continued to be kept as a slave. So Scott went to a Missouri court and then sued for his freedom. The case was eventually appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, which rendered its decision in 1857, really only 2 days after Buchanan was sworn in as president. A majority of the court decided that Scott should lose his case, and they gave a couple of reasons. First, they said that Dred Scott had no right to sue in a federal court because the framers of the Constitution did not intend people of African descent to be U.S. citizens. And if they're not U.S. citizens, then African Americans did not have the right to sue. Also, they said that Congress did not have the power to deprive any person of property without due process of law. So if slaves were a form of property, then Congress could not exclude slavery from any federal territory. So that means that all of these territories that used to be slave or free territories now were open to slavery. So because Congress's law of 1820, that Missouri Compromise, excluded slavery from Wisconsin and Illinois and other northern territories, that law was unconstitutional. So as you can imagine, Southern Democrats were delighted with the court's ruling, but Northern Republicans were really shocked and indignant. In effect, the Supreme Court declared that all parts of the Western territories were open to slavery. Republicans denounced the Dred Scott decision. Because of the timing of the decision, right after Buchanan's inauguration, many Northerners sort of suspected that the Democratic president and the Democratic majority of the Supreme Court had secretly planned this Dred Scott decision. And they were sort of maybe secretly conspiring to settle the slavery question once and for all. The decision increased Northerners' suspicions of a slave power conspiracy. It also induced thousands of former Democrats to start voting Republican. So it's going to increase that sectional tension. So Northern Democrats were left with the almost impossible task of supporting popular sovereignty without repudiating the Dred Scott decision. So the hopes for a sectional compromise were really put in jeopardy. Then in 1858, you've got this debate between Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln, who were both campaigning to be senator from Illinois. It's in this debate that the hottest issue is the issue of slavery. Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He's really a moderate, and he's a Republican. He's a moderate who's against the expansion of slavery. So he could effectively speak of slavery as a moral issue. He actually said a couple of quotes in this speech that are very famous, like, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." And accepting the Illinois Republicans' nomination, that the candidate delivered his celebrated House Divided speech, where he says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." But in this context, he's referring to the United States as the House. So Democrats in the South are starting to worry. They realize that, okay, people in the North are saying that we have to resolve the slavery issue once and for all. A house divided against itself cannot stand means the entire country should allow slavery, or the entire country should forbid slavery. So really, the fanatical and probably mentally unstable John Brown confirmed the South's worst fears of radical abolitionists. He tried to start a slave uprising in Virginia in October of 1859. His efforts would cause him to lead a small band of followers. Of these followers, this included his 4 sons and some former slaves, and they tried to attack a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. His plan is really impractical. He wanted to use guns from the arsenal to arm Virginia's slaves. He had sent out a notice to these slaves and invited them to rise up in a general revolt. Federal troops under the command of Robert E. Lee ended up capturing Brown and all of his followers after a 2-day siege. John Brown would be tried for treason, convicted, and hanged. Moderates in the North, including Republican leaders, condemned Brown's use of violence, but Southerners were not really convinced by their words. A lot of Southern whites saw the raid as final proof of the North's true intentions, to use slave revolts to destroy the South. And because John Brown spoke with pretty simple eloquence at his trial of his humanitarian motives and wanting to free the slaves, he was hailed as a martyr by many anti-slavery Northerners. He's sort of seen as a terrorist in the South. A few years later, when the Civil War broke out, John Brown was actually celebrated by advancing Northern armies when they sang, "Glory, glory, hallelujah, his soul is marching on," in the battle hymn of the Republic. They're talking about John Brown. The final event that triggered the South's decision to leave the Union was the election of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was the Republican candidate for president in 1860. So after John Brown's raid, most Americans understood that their country was moving to the brink of disunion. And as 1860 began, the Democratic Party represented the last practical hope for coalition and compromise. The Democrats ended up dividing over this issue, however, and nominating multiple candidates. they deadlocked in their first convention at Charleston, and then after that they met again in Baltimore. In the Baltimore Convention, many delegates from the slave states ended up walking out, which enabled the remaining delegates to nominate Stephen Douglas on a platform of popular sovereignty. But then Southern Democrats held their own convention in Baltimore and nominated Vice President John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky as their candidate. So when the Republicans met in Chicago, they really enjoyed the prospect of an easy win because the Democrats were so divided. They really made the most of their advantage by drafting a platform that appealed strongly to the economic self-interest of Northerners and Westerners. They nominated Abraham Lincoln as their candidate, even though William Seward was also a popular choice. But William Seward was kind of hot-headed, and a lot of people were opposed to him, whereas Lincoln was a brilliant debater. So they thought that he could win the loyalty of the Midwestern states, the Northern states, and the Western states. So there's a fourth political party that forms in the beginning of this. It's called the Constitutional Union Party. The Constitutional Union Party is made up of members of former Whigs, Know-Nothings, and moderate Democrats. They nominated John Bell of Tennessee. The platform of the Constitutional Union Party was to enforce the laws of the Constitution and preserve the Union. So while Douglas campaigned across the country, Lincoln confidently remained at home in Illinois. He met with Republican leaders, he gave statements to the press, and the election results were pretty predictable. Lincoln ended up carrying one of the free states, every single one of the free states of the North. So that's going to represent a solid majority, 59% of the electoral votes. He only won 39.8% of the popular vote, so he's really considered a minority president. Breckinridge carried the Deep South. Douglas and Bell sort of just carried a few electoral votes in the border states. Together, Douglas as a Northern Democrat and Breckinridge as a Southern Democrat received many more of the popular votes than Lincoln. So that means the Democrats had more of the popular votes than Lincoln, but because they were so divided, they couldn't secure a majority for the election. So the new political party, the Republican Party, the reality was that those populous free states had enough electoral votes to select a president without the need for a single electoral vote from the South. So the Republicans controlled neither the Congress nor the Supreme Court. Even so, the election of Lincoln was all that Southern secessionists needed to call for immediate disunion. So in December of 1860, at a special convention in South Carolina, they voted unanimously to secede. Within the next few months, 7 states of the Deep South met in Alabama and created the Confederate States of America. So the constitution of this would-be Southern nation was really similar to the U.S. Constitution, except that the Confederacy placed limits on the government's power to impose tariffs and restrict slavery. They elected President Jefferson Davis, and they also elected a vice president of the Confederacy, who was Alexander Stephens of Georgia. So, a lame duck president. Buchanan had 5 months in office before President-elect Lincoln was due to succeed him. Buchanan was a conservative who really did nothing to prevent the secession of the South. Congress was much more active. In a last-ditch effort to appease the South, Senator John Crittenden of Kentucky proposed a constitutional amendment that would guarantee the right to hold slaves in all territories south of 3630. Lincoln said that he could not accept this compromise because it violated the Republican position against extension of slavery into the territories. So Southern whites who voted for secession believed they were acting in the tradition of the Revolution. the American Revolution back of the 1770s. They argue that they had a right to national independence and to dissolve a constitutional compact